Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guests for this series are Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa. Stuart is director of programming and diversity recruitment at the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut. Lee is a professor of music education at Wilfrid Laurier University. In addition to their faculty positions, Lee is the editor of Community Music at the Boundaries, published in 2021 by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, and Mary and Stuart are co-authors of the forthcoming Music Making in U.S. Prisons, Listening to Incarcerated Voices, also published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. We'll get to hear about our guests' books, but we'll also be having a discussion about community music, its anti-institutional roots, its inherent activist and inclusive characteristics, and how this relatively new area of scholarship has flipped the instructional model to make the musician privileged over the music. Even further, we'll speak with Mary and Stuart about how music can transform a broken system. The series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this third episode, we discuss community music's activist roots and characteristics. So Lee, your book focuses on the shifting boundaries of community music, and we've talked a little bit about that in an earlier episode, particularly in the areas of education, health and wellness, cultural identity, and indigenous communities. So my question is, how does prioritizing community and flexible borders naturally lead to activist intentions?
Another big question. So let's start with the premise that most scholarly and serious music professions are taking place within the academy, we often call conservatories or schools of music, where we focus primarily on the music as an artifact. It's a piece of something that's been created that we analyze, we study it, we perform it, we try to perform it as accurately and contextually accurate as possible. So performance practices are huge. And so it's all about the music.
Mm-hmm.
But when we move out of that central kind of temple of that domain of rare music making, we find out that music is happening in various iterations and in various contexts that people aren't so worried about its origin, its accuracy, its preciseness, but they're really more interested in the impact that it has or the effect that it has on the musicer and the music listener. And so if we start looking at music as being the musician that we're privileging rather than the artifact of music, then we automatically start to see human conditions. We see where there's a power imbalance, or where there's socioeconomic neglect, or where there's environmental justice has not been taking place, and we see, in aging populations, myself included, where the quality of life is enhanced greatly by participatory music making. So it just naturally lends itself to shining a light or a lens on things that are of concern, what we call cultural and social concerns. So when we look at, for example, in Canada, one of our huge issues is the residential schools for Indigenous children that took place from the beginning of the 20th century right through to the mid 60s. And this was an act to assimilate young Native children into Eurocentric ways of dressing, speaking, eating, and musicking. So now, for us to build a relationship with the community that's been wounded, torn, and ripped apart, one of the ways we can build this relationship is through sharing music together. And so that's just an example. And again, there's some rich examples of that in the book, that where the deepest respect is on the part of the settler person with the Indigenous member of our community. The respect is often shown through singing and dancing and drumming, where we invite we create a place in our formerly walled institutions where music doesn't count. There is now a sense of place, and that's just one example. And I could go on that, but I think there is a natural way when you take your eyes off the perfecting of pre-composed music and put it onto the personhood of the people making the music. There's a shift right away in the intention for that music.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. In 2019, the rapper No Name launched No Name Book Club, which, quote, is an online IRL community dedicated to uplifting POC voices. In 2020, the organization began its prison program, which sends the book picks on topics like prison writing, Black liberation, and resistance to incarcerated people around the U.S. So, why are programs like this, especially those run by Black organizers, so important in fighting the prison industrial complex and supporting the incarcerated? And Mary, I'll just start with you on that.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. This is a really great question. And thanks for letting us know about No Name Book Club. A big gratitude to her for this work she's doing. Really, really glad to know that they provide books for incarcerated people as well as anyone in the community. Brilliant list of books. And I think anyone doing arts based work in prisons needs to lean on the wisdom of people who have been or currently are incarcerated. Whites need to listen to the experiences and stories of Black, Indigenous people of color, including reading books from the No Name Book Club, and especially explore their musical interests, invite them to be musical leaders, which is something I plan to do more of when we can restart the Oakdale Choir, following on wisdom of educators like Gloria Lodson Billings, culturally relevant pedagogy, and the culturally sustaining pedagogies that Django Paris and Sam Aleem have explored. And some of the other things that are available now for exploring that we can really lean on and grow related to this topic. The just last academic year, the University of California, Santa Cruz created a Visualizing Abolition webinar series that included a musical video collection curated by Terry Lynn Carrington that is called Music for Abolition. My One of my favorites of that collection is Nicholas Payton's Freedom is No Fear, where he puts clips in by Nina Simone. It's a great visual and an oral piece. Brian Stevenson, author of Just Mercy and his Equal Justice Initiative, he argues quite a lot for the need for proximity, which I think is one of the things we've talked about earlier in our conversations about how music making can provide a space for proximity. Michelle Alexander she just gave a talk at our university last Tuesday or Wednesday night. It was brilliant. In her book, The New Jim Crow. Reuben Jonathan Miller has a new book titled Halfway Home, Race, Punishment, and the Afterlife of Mass Incarceration. Bettina Love and the Abolitionist Teaching Network is a brilliant group of educators, Black educators that we can learn from. Jason Soul and Andre Wright created a program. They're called Humanize My Hoodie. And then a book that just came out in October is Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionists, Police, Protest, and the Pursuit of Freedom. Next year, Ruth Wilson Gilmore will be having a book come out titled Change Everything, Racial Capitalism and the Case for Abolition. We must lean on the wisdom of so many Black scholars and activists. They are brilliant, and we can just grow so much by connecting and learning and listening.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I was hoping to just add in there, Bill, if this is all right.
Of course.
I think one thing for some listeners who may not have worked or been involved in prisons is that folks who are incarcerated do not have much access, or almost have no access to the outside world in terms of information and technology, or at least it's highly controlled in certain situations. So books are often some of the only ways that folks who are incarcerated can learn or find out new information. And I do wonder to what extent those libraries have large budgets. Probably not. They probably are not stocked very well. And I wonder what voices are represented in those books. Mm-hmm. Probably books from decades ago, mm-hmm. and probably very white-centric voices.
Right.
And so I think what No Name is doing is super important. She's basically being able to get these books by Black activists and activists of color into incarcerated systems is giving voice voice to a voice that's already suppressed within the system. So I think it's so important to start, putting books into places where incarcerated folk can have access, where otherwise they wouldn't have access to this. They can't search on the internet. They can't, they don't have cell phone devices to be able to find out the latest news. In the best cases, they have a TV that they can watch, which has, a set number of channels and limited to certain amounts per day. So I think really more of this and highlighting this is a super important part of the work that white folks can do to remove those barriers, to help get those voices into those incarcerated spaces.
Excellent. Okay. So as three white people studying a topic related to activism, and in your case, Stuart and Mary, as you examine the U.S. prison system, which disproportionately affects Black people and people of color, can you talk about the balance between effectively fighting for progressive social change while not silencing or decentering the work of Black activists and activists of color? And as we're thinking about this question, let's also think about how this applies to the queer, transgender, and other communities as well. Lee, I'll just kind of start with you on that one.
I feel that in order for me to do any of this kind of work, I have to remind myself of my own location. As a white heterosexual, highly educated, well-paid, with a secure job person that has resources to, quote, help others. But in so doing, it's very possible that I'm harming, because I'm perpetuating that tradition of white male power. And so it's a really delicate walk. And it's a walk where I've gotten to the point now where I just want to be on the sideline as a listener, to learn and to hear, and then to ask myself, can I make space for somebody else to do this work? Is it possible that by my name being on a document that it's already caused harm? And so these are the questions, I'll defer to my colleagues to chime in, but I would like to give you a couple of examples of where I think we're making some progress. But I would much prefer to hear from Stuart and Mary before I do that.
Okay. Stuart, we'll go to you.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughts, Lee. And I certainly mirror and hear those. I think that there's an important tension, however, that needs careful consideration here. And that is the balance between advocating, empowering, and making spaces for BIPOC voices. And by BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color, to be heard and amplified, but at the same time knowing that white folk have to be willing to put in the work too. The burden of labor cannot rest solely on BIPOC folk and needs to be compensated. So let me offer an example here from at least my experience within various academic spaces. Just looking at the various conversations that occur across various university-focused publications, many US universities struggle with retaining faculty of color. Not only have faculty of color frequently faced more barriers to entry and hurdles to cross than their white colleagues to get a tenure-track position in the first place, but they face further pressure as the only, or often the only, junior faculty member of color who then gets tapped to support diversity retention, recruitment of students, faculty of color. Yet, and this is the important point here, that labor or work is rarely adequately rewarded in terms of their promotion prospects. Instead, university promotion, tenure, and review boards reward publications, research, and grants, while often minimizing those other elements that people of color are expected to perform, either implicitly or explicitly. So what I'm trying to say here is that as a white male, I want to support, advocate, and empower people of color whenever possible, moving out the way to make space. But at the same time, the burden of work cannot fall entirely upon BIPOC folk to fix the mistakes of white male-based systems of oppression.
Excellent. Mary, anything you want to add to that?
I want to say thank you. I agree with everything Lee and Stuart have mentioned, and I find my role as a need to educate myself, continually reading some of the books and the authors that I mentioned earlier in my answer, and creating spaces for people, for my students and others I interact with, to learn the true history, and also creating spaces to build relationships and inviting one another to really listen and hear what people are experiencing, so we can come to a deeper understanding of of each person's truth, and then reimagine and reflect on what how do we want to interact in a society, and what are the ways that we need to how do we need to change, and how do we need to learn to really honor one another's stories in order to build a more caring community.
Great. Thank you.
Can I add just one more part in there, please, Bill?
Of course. Yep.
I'm just thinking here, the last part of your question was particularly important, and it's something I've been thinking, struggling, grappling with, wondering how I can be a support agent in advocating for folks who potentially are a member of a BIPOC community, but then also part of other communities, or their identities they associate with potentially, being queer or being transgender. And the thing that comes to mind here is, safety is the word here. How can someone who identifies with multiple minorities that makes that space extra unsafe for them to come into? How can I, as a white male, be aware that I have that privilege of safety almost anywhere I go, barring a few exceptions. But for folks who have these marginalized identities, it's the complete opposite. So what would it mean for me to suddenly put myself in that space where I do feel unsafe? Mm-hmm. And how can I be a change agent to support those folks in finding that safe space to be? Because it might be that folks who do identify as LGBTQIA+ don't feel like they can put their voice out there because it doesn't feel safe to them. And especially in incarcerated systems, there's a whole load of extra identity formation crisis, especially for the trans community, about how would that look within an incarcerated situation. So I think, we're at the beginning of this work, and we have to be support agents in working out how can we make spaces safer for those voices, for those peoples to live out their life in the full without feeling like they're being further minoritized in those situations.
Right. So, Lee, let's come back around to you for that.
So, two quick examples of where I think intentions are great, but possibly fraught with danger. I work at a university named for Canada's first French-Canadian Prime Minister, Sir Wilfrid Laurier. He was a pretty, I think, nobly respected prime minister in the first part of the 20th century. But it's come out recently that he refused immigration from the Caribbean diaspora who wanted to move to Canada. And it turns out that he was pretty racist. And so I'm working in a university where there's a committee already established to look at the name and the legacy of our prime minister that we're named for. At the same time, the university has agreed to hire 12, we'll call them inclusive excellent hires. And they're 6 people of Indigenous identification and 6 people of Black identification. There are some rules around identification and the authenticity of your ID. So, but there's also a different kind of system for hiring where maybe a terminal degree isn't required, or maybe other equivalencies are used. The Faculty of Music where I work has been awarded 1 Indigenous and 1 Black scholar for hiring. Now, no one can argue that these are bad ideas. We shouldn't be hiring these people. But as Stuart has said, the burden of work cannot rest on the new hires' shoulders. So we've got an Indigenous music scholar, we've got a Black. Now they don't, they're on our committees. We're diverse. Look at us. It's a problem. I see that one of our elders said you need to hire 2 of each minimum, because you can't have one person speaking for their culture. You cannot do that. I cannot speak for my culture entirely. So there's an excitement there, but then as Stuart mentioned, how will the promotion and tenure processes be for these people? Will they be another set of? So I parked that one. The second one, we have a little museum in town. Our city's about 650,000 people. It's a bunch of towns and cities all together. And there's a museum. And the museum has landed this Rolling Stones exhibition called Unzipped. They're coming at the end of this month. Everyone's excited about the Rolling Stones coming here. But somebody brought to someone's attention that the Rolling Stones, as essentially a blues band, built their reputation on the shoulders of Black Southern musicians and to some degrees exploited them. Others might argue that they uplifted them, but there's an art. So then the museum decided, well, we've got to do something. We have a epic blues legacy in town under the name of Mel Brown. He came from Texas and he built a blues culture here. He died a few years ago. So they want to build a statue to Mel Brown so that there's a statue of Mel Brown who documented was, in fact, in touch with Mick Jagger a fair bit around the early days. Long story short, a bunch of people in the academy and in the community have rallied together. We've gotten some pretty significant funding from our federal government social services and humanities, social sciences and humanities research council to put on a festival and a symposium that celebrates Black art and Black culture and questions the injustices of a white privilege curriculum in the academy. So my role as the primary agent behind this, the principal investigator, is in fact to step aside. We've got a team working on this thing. It's going to happen in a big way, hopefully successful way, but it's going to raise a lot of questions about why are the white guys getting the funding, providing the venues, creating the space. And so we're working this through. But all of that to say, I think universities across the world are grappling with this. And I also think that there are some really solid attempts to at least explore the injustices that have happened over the decades, and if not centuries, within universities. So I stay tuned. I mean, I would love to come back at the end of May and report on this for you.
All right. So Mary generously provided a list of individuals and groups that are doing meaningful work in this space, and I'd like to invite Stuart and Lee to also weigh in on some of these.
I don't have anything specific. Mary's list would have, trumped mine in many ways. Okay. I think we do need to be aware that there's a cultural uniqueness in Canada that is different from the U.S. And in many ways, Canada's reputation for being a polite society has masked some fairly deep systemic racist beliefs and practices here. While we don't have the big tradition of slavery, we do have a slavery tradition, and we also have a very tortured relationship with Indigenous peoples since settler treaties were drawn up. So there are a lot of publications written by Indigenous authors, and I would say that Canada's focus has been on indigeneity over anti-Black racism as much.
Yeah, I think that's great. I was just going to share two other little thoughts that came to mind as we're chatting. One is what's fascinating in North America is we have a beautiful history of Native American tribal practices that are all about restorative justice, sentencing circles, practices that are more horizontal rather than vertical as far as people listening and hearing one another's stories. So those are still happening. We have really a lot of amazing things happening with Native American tribes currently in North America. So I think it's important as non-natives that we, again, listen and learn from them. And really interesting to hear what's happening there in Canada with this Rolling Stones concert and the museum's response to that. I've been on a think tank in the United States called since summer of 2019, I think was when we started. It's the Alliance for the Transformation of the Musical Academy. The forethinker of this is Ed Sareth, who wrote a book called Black Music Matters and is working on another one about musical racism in the academy and the need to have more Black music centered. So between some of that work that's happening, and I mentioned culturally sustaining pedagogies, those are people decentering whiteness and music educators really curious how we can do this. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that we are growing in meaningful ways in this complex topic.
You just heard from Mary Cohen, Stuart Duncan, and Lee Willingham. Mary is an associate professor of music education at the University of Iowa, Stewart is Director of Programming and Diversity Recruitment, the Graduate School at the University of Connecticut, and Lee is a Professor of Music Education at Wilfrid Laurier University. This episode is brought to you in part by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week for a discussion about intersectionality in community music as well as its development into the future.
It's the sense of cancellation of Beethoven versus the sense in which no one wants to do that, but at the same point, it's the metric by which all these other, and I use that in quotes here, other musics are judged by. And I just wonder whether trying to set up two systems side by side where here's your traditional music, I read, white, dead, German-centric music that's privileged versus these other musics are being judged by the same metrics. And whether we need to, this idea of tearing down the hierarchy is not so much throwing away the traditional music, but is instead not using the same metrics to analyze, to assess, to provide value to, or assume value from non-traditional music.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.